Bill Maher recently put out a fantastic video titled What's Wrong with Grandma, where he basically discusses interactions that have changed within recent generations between younger people and older people, and how life has changed for older people in regards to how they obtain their information and spread it. And he did a fantastic job, and this is a topic that I've been wanting to talk to people about for a long time. So I'm going to provide a response video to what he said, give my thoughts. But before I get into the main part of the video, I've got one little thing I need to complain about.
Well, okay, boomer isn't an argument. It's actually an admission you don't have one. Gen Z complains a lot that I make fun of them, but I don't feel too bad about it because they never engage with the idea itself. It's always just, you're old. Yeah, that's not an argument. It's a prejudice, the thing you purport to hate.
So Bill Maher is right. Okay, boomer is not an argument. But I think he doesn't seem to understand that the response is really more of a way of dealing with older people when you sense that they have no interest in expanding their own perspective. Because older people have the tendency to be stuck in their ways and disinterested in genuine conversation. They're more interested, like most people, in just teaching others about their opinions. So, okay boomer is usually just a response to let the other person know that they're no longer interested in the conversation and they're going to avoid unnecessary conflict that won't get them anywhere.
So we have to figure out why so many seniors are so susceptible to fake news. Now, part of it is, unlike the kids, they didn't grow up with bullshit media. Corporate-funded, narrative-driven, and completely partisan. So when that came along, they had no immunity for it. Boomers, we grew up with old-school Time magazine and Walter Cronkite. Closest thing to fake news back then was pretending Liberace was looking for a woman.
I'm going to have to disagree here with Maher real quick because media has always been at least partial bullshit. Now, I don't doubt that there was less crap in media before news became so popularized like it is now. But the news outlets from probably the beginning of time have always been manipulated by somebody, whether you were a crier standing out in the middle of a public circle, letting everybody know what the government wanted you to think. You were paid by somebody to spread the news. And that news was always influenced by what those people that gave you the information wanted you to hear. Now, our grandparents obviously grew up in a very different age, especially if you've got grandparents like me who are actually from the silent generation in the very early 1920s. And right around that time is when our country, our entire world went through a very dramatic change in the way it receives education and the way it receives its information. We've evolved rapidly since then. But right around their time, our entire world was still very much a blue-collar society. And in that kind of society, everyone's working the same kind of jobs. They're mostly laborious. Education was limited, and we mostly got educated through our social circles. That's the way it was, and there were very limited options to get educated outside of that. We did not have the internet. We did not have access to peer-reviewed journals unless you ordered them. Now we can do it just through a Google search. We can access all of the world's knowledge just through a Google search. They had nothing close to that. Now, because they did not have access to all of those information sources, they had to make do with what was available to them. And they all pretty much had access to the same information. And the people who had access to that information the longest were the elderly. So naturally, the elderly were respected scholars of cultural information. Things have changed since then, and the elderly have failed to keep up. Towards the end of his video, he states that we treat older people like idiots, basically, and younger people like sages. And that's definitely true. We definitely overestimate the value of especially young teenagers who have no idea what they're talking about. But the real issue, I think, here is the basis for respect. And that's something that seems to be lost on the elderly because they expect respect, because that was what they were taught to do to their elders, and they don't understand why they're no longer receiving it. So, what is the basis for respect, especially in relationship to respecting your elders? It's whether or not you have knowledge. And that's the thing, is that I'm not saying that the elderly don't have knowledge anymore. It very much depends on how much they've challenged themselves, whether or not they've been focusing on growth. Does Grandpa have a PhD? Does Grandpa have any degree whatsoever? Or has he mostly been in his blue-collar job his whole life? And then after, where he got done with his work, he came home, turned on the Fox or the CNN, and allowed himself to become vegetative. Your access to information and how thoroughly you dedicate yourself to vetting that information and growing is what results in respect for you as you get into your elderly stages of life. Not just the fact that you are old. Being old in itself does not warrant respect. It's the information you obtain over time and the growth you go through. Now, I also want to make sure it's clear that I'm not saying that you have to have a degree in order to be considered knowledgeable, wise, or respectable. The formal education system is just what I most quickly associate with education and knowledge. There's plenty of other ways that you can become informed on lots of issues, obviously.
A recent study found that a mere 2,100 people accounted for spreading 80% of the fake news on Twitter during the last election, and most of them were older, white, Republican women. We have met the Russian trollbot army, and it's your Aunt Bonnie.
Now, in this clip, we have hidden in there the underlying reason as to why they're being disrespected and why the misinformation is being spread by them. And the reason why they are spreading misinformation is because older people, more so than the younger generation, at least by a little bit, depend heavily on a trust system to determine whether or not news is correct. Now, trust is a feeling, and human feelings are statistically, demonstrably unreliable, but that is exactly what they depend on. Humans evolved our sense of trust to satisfy Maslow's hierarchy of needs at the very bottom level. Trust exists, trust evolved for us to gain a sense of security in our environment. And that part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that part of our brain structure involved in trust, is on the inside. It's not on the outer cognitive portion of our brain. So when you are using trust to validate information, you are using the primal structures of your brain, not the thinking parts. But that is exactly what older people do. They use the primate portions of their brain to validate information. So there's that old saying, the opposites attract, but it's wrong. Similarities attract. And you'll notice that people tend to talk together in social circles of people that agree with them, typically. If you're discussing politics, people tend to not like discussing politics around people that they know have different beliefs. So by using the trust system, you are naturally functioning around people that you know think like you. You are literally a walking echo chamber of confirmation bias. And fixing that issue opens up another can of worms, doesn't it? Because we can't afford, obviously, to send elderly people back to school, teach them philosophy, teach them the scientific method, teach them information validation methods. So it's kind of on them, unfortunately. They have to be willing to accept that the methods that they used for validating information growing up are no longer valid. It was the best that they had available during the time that they were raised in. But it's not good. And they have to be willing to accept that. it almost feels a little bit like we are, what's the term for it? Gaslighting. It feels a little bit like we have to tell them that they've been gaslit their entire life, and everything that they've used to validate information is no longer valid. That's a rough pill to swallow. But in order for them to start being respected as information sources, not misinformation spreading idiots, that has to happen. Now, Bill Maher also suggests that maybe the reason why old people are becoming so hateful is because they feel underappreciated and dismissed, and because we haven't been treating them very kindly. My response to that is that if you want to be respected as a leader, you need to be the one that makes the first efforts. Actually lead, not levy expectations that you be treated better.